In what may be the most consequential story of our generation yet, the FBI has just executed a search warrant against Rudy Giuliani, searching his apartment and his office and seizing electronic devices. That is to say, the current administration, a rival political party, has authorized the FBI to seize electronic devices and search the home and workplace of the previous president's former lawyer. Of course, the left will say that Donald Trump's corrupt administration was protecting Rudy Giuliani from criminal prosecution. And those on the right will say this is retribution. But my friends, it gets worse. As part of the investigation, it seems the feds are trying to find communications between Rudy Giuliani and journalist John Solomon of Just the News. This is not just a new administration going after the previous administration. It's even them going after journalists. Say what you will about John Solomon and what you think about his reporting and the claims made by the mainstream media. He is still a journalist. And Just the News, the organization he runs, is even certified as credible by NewsGuard. Now, you don't have to trust NewsGuard because I do think they're biased, but this means that this is not some fly-by-night far-right fringe conspiracy website. This is an award-winning journalist who had worked, I believe John Solomon worked for the Washington Post and the Associated Press, now being targeted by the federal government. This may very well be retaliation. But to me, this is all part of getting back on track. You see, this has a lot to do with what we're seeing over in Russia and Ukraine. Russia has been amassing troops near the Ukrainian border, and many are concerned war is coming. Now, what does that have to do with Rudy Giuliani getting raided? Well, the investigation has to do with whether or not Giuliani was lobbying illegally on behalf of a foreign government. And that may be the case, or it may be that Donald Trump didn't see Russia as that big of a threat and viewed China as a much bigger threat. Before Donald Trump got elected, there was an escalation in the tensions between Ukraine and Russia. In fact, I was even on the ground personally in Ukraine at the start of the Euromaidan protests, which eventually led to a separatist movement or civil war, as some would call it. There's some speculation that Western powers want to gain control of Ukraine to offset a Russian natural gas monopoly. And this ties into a lot. This is a big story. There's concerns that this involves Syria, and it has to do with U.S. intelligence interests in offsetting natural gas monopolies into Europe. It is through Ukraine that Russia controls about 80% of the natural gas going into Europe, which brings us to Joe Biden. It brings us to Burisma, Hunter Biden's involvement in Ukrainian natural gas companies, and the Biden-Ukraine conspiracy, as it's being called on Wikipedia. The story is big, my friends, and this is where it gets bigger, because this is where we can see maybe there is no real... Look, if you're the president and you make a decision, it could come back to haunt you. What is truly the will of the people when the military-industrial complex and the intelligence agencies have an interest in engaging in war? And it may be that they think they're fighting for the best interests of the American people, but is our government really going to represent the views of the people, or is it going to represent the establishment political class and what they think is best? Let's read the story about Rudy Giuliani, what's going on, and let me show you how this ties into Russia and how war may be coming. Before we get started, head over to timcast.com, click that big old members only button, and become a member to get access to the members area where you can see exclusive members only content from the Timcast IRL podcast. Becoming a member helps support my work and this show in the event we get banned, because we talk about pretty spicy things. You can find my work at timcast.com, so long as even that is allowed to exist. My friends, this story is really, really serious stuff, and I hope you understand the gravity of what it means that the previous president's lawyer is being targeted by the new administration. When Donald Trump was chanting, "Lock her up" about Hillary Clinton, many people on the left were saying this is chilling. What do you think it is when the federal government goes after the previous president's lawyer? Chilling, to say the least. So become a member at timcast.com, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Let's read from the New York Times. Federal investigators searched Rudy Giuliani's apartment and office. Prosecutors obtained the search warrants as part of an investigation into whether Mr. Giuliani broke lobbying laws as President Trump's personal lawyer. They say the investigators seized Mr. Giuliani's electronic devices and searched his apartment on Madison Avenue and his office on Park Avenue at about 6 a.m., two of the people said. Executing a search warrant is an extraordinary move for prosecutors to take against a lawyer, let alone a lawyer for a former president. It is a major turning point in the long-running investigation into Mr. Giuliani, who, as mayor, steered New York through September 11th, and earlier in his career led the same U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan that is now investigating him. Mr. Giuliani's lawyer, Robert J. Costello, called the searches unnecessary because his client had offered to answer questions from prosecutors, except those regarding his privileged communications with the former president. Quote, "What they did today was legal thuggery," Mr. Costello said. "Why would you do this to anyone, let alone someone who was the Associate Attorney General, United States Attorney, the mayor of New York City, and the personal lawyer to the 45th president of the United States?" I'll show you why. I'll show you why, and you'll start to get it. The federal authorities have been largely focused on whether Mr. Giuliani illegally lobbied the Trump administration in 2019 on behalf of Ukrainian officials and oligarchs, who at the time were helping Mr. Giuliani search for dirt on Mr. Trump's political rivals, including President Biden, who was then a leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. Let me slow down right there. When Ukrainegate emerged, where they accused Trump of trying to dig up dirt on Joe Biden was not a contender for the presidency. He had not announced. Many on the left were saying, "Oh, yeah, but we all know he's gonna." Sure, I guess. But even when Joe Biden was running, he was not considered to be a leading figure. In fact, he wasn't doing all that well until a bunch of Democratic candidates dropped out. I guess the FBI knew that Joe Biden was going to run anyway, which then the question arises. Why is Joe Biden not being subjected to FEC regulation if the federal government knew he was going to run for president? The reason many of these politicians don't announce they're running is because there are regulations on what you can do in terms of raising money. But if they knew that was his intent, doesn't it seem like he's circumventing election laws? Or perhaps there are establishment political class interests in having Joe Biden assume the role of president and then to get back on schedule with our escalating conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Perhaps. They go on to say, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan and the FBI had for months sought to secure a search warrant for Mr. Giuliani's phones. Under Mr. Trump's senior political appointees in the Justice Department repeatedly sought to block such a warrant, the New York Times reported, slowing the investigation as it was gaining momentum last year. After Merrick Garland was confirmed as President Biden's Attorney General, the Justice Department lifted its objection to the search. That is to say, when the Democrats gained the executive branch, they greenlit the FBI to go after Trump's lawyer. While the warrants are not an explicit accusation of wrongdoing against Giuliani, it shows that the investigation has entered an aggressive new phase. To obtain a search warrant, investigators need to persuade a judge they have sufficient reason to believe that a crime was committed and that the search would turn up evidence of a crime. Spokesmen for the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to comment. The investigation of Mr. Giuliani grew out of a case against two Soviet-born men who aided his mission in Ukraine to unearth damaging information about Mr. Biden and his son Hunter, who was on the board of a Ukrainian energy company. The prosecutors charged the two men, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, with unrelated crimes in late 2019, as a trial is scheduled for October. Let's pause for a second. Was Giuliani trying to dig up dirt on a man who wasn't currently running for president? Maybe. No, seriously. Maybe Giuliani, working for Trump, knew that Biden was likely going to be the main contender, someone who the Democrats viewed favorably, who was part of the Obama administration, and thus had a good chance of winning. Or maybe Rudy Giuliani was investigating corruption, legitimate corruption. I mean, if you follow the reporting of Matt Taibbi, that may be the case. However, Matt Taibbi, being, in my opinion, a great reporter, points out that Giuliani was taking a maximalist approach, looking at what Biden was doing and then assuming the worst. Does that mean that Rudy Giuliani actually had dirt on Joe Biden or had proof of corruption? No, it could be that he was making grand assumptions. but his intent may not have been to lobby for a foreign government. He maybe just thought something that wasn't true or took a, as Matt Taibbi says, maximalist approach to this. They go on to say, while investigating Mr. Giuliani, prosecutors have examined, among other things, his potential business dealings in Ukraine and his role in pushing the Trump administration to oust the American ambassador to Ukraine, which was a subject of testimony at Mr. Trump's first impeachment trial. As he was pressuring Ukrainian officials to investigate the Bidens, Mr. Giuliani became fixated on removing the ambassador Marie L. Yovanovitch, whom he saw as an obstacle to those efforts. At the urging of Mr. Giuliani and other Republicans, Mr. Trump ultimately ousted Ms. Yovanovitch. As part of the investigation into Mr. Giuliani, the prosecutors have explored whether he was working not only for Mr. Trump, but also for Ukrainian officials or businesses who wanted the ambassador to be dismissed for their own reasons, according to people briefed on the matter. Under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, it is a federal crime to try to influence or lobby the U.S. government at the request or direction of a foreign official without disclosing it to the Justice Department. That may be the case. But here's what I find strange. Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor, the mayor of New York City, he was a political elite. Did he all of a sudden just have a change of heart and then seek to work against the United States? I mean, the conspiracy theorists for a long time thought Giuliani was part of the establishment political class. So what happened? I have no idea. But let me show you where this gets really, really scary. You don't like Giuliani, fine. You don't like Trump, fine. Maybe that's the case. But what about when the FBI is going after journalists for simply reporting on these things? The Wall Street Journal says Giuliani's New York apartment searched by federal investigators. But this is where it gets really interesting. Mr. Costello said authorities arrived at Mr. Giuliani's apartment at 6 a.m. and seized his electronic devices. Mr. Costello said the search warrant describes the investigation as a probe into a possible violation of foreign lobbying rules. Mr. Costello said the warrant sought communications between Giuliani and individuals including John Solomon, a columnist who was in communication with Mr. Giuliani about his effort to push for investigations of Joe Biden in Ukraine. A columnist? Interesting. The Wall Street Journal won't even call him what he is, a journalist. John Solomon runs Just the News. Even Just the News is even NewsGuard certified Just the News as credible. Now, they have some issues with them, sure, but they say they're a credible outlet. John Solomon may have been accused of being an opinion guy, sure. But to say he's not a journalist, to say this is not a violation of the First Amendment, this is really scary. Now, I don't know what's to come of this. And of course, I'm already seeing far left Antifa anonymous hacker types, people that I knew have known for 10 years or longer, are now cheering on the FBI. And it's really quite amazing, to say the least, to see these far leftists who for the longest time opposed the federal government now cheering them on. That's how you know things are getting really creepy and weird. But let's talk about what this is about. Let me show you what this is all about. Now, I can't tell you definitively what Trump was trying to do, what Giuliani was trying to do, what the current administration is trying to do. I can tell you a little bit that scratches the surface. As they mentioned over the New York Times, Giuliani was digging up dirt, they say, against Joe Biden over perceived corruption in Ukraine. There's a Wikipedia article called The Biden-Ukraine Conspiracy Theory. Interestingly, it's not a theory unless you frame it as the most extreme interpretation available. They say, the conspiracy theory alleges that then Vice President Biden withheld loan guarantees to pressure Ukraine into firing a prosecutor to prevent a corruption investigation into Burisma and to protect his son. Although the U.S. did withhold government aid to pressure Ukraine into removing the corrupt and effective prosecutor, notice they say corrupt and ineffective. This is a propaganda piece. First, it wasn't the U.S. We're talking about Joe Biden. Joe Biden's the one who bragged to doing this. They say this was the official and bipartisan policy of the federal government of the U.S., which, along with the EU, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, believed the prosecutor to be too lenient in investigating corruption. That all may be true. Absolutely. But let's look at framing really quick. They should say, although Joe Biden did withhold government aid to pressure Ukraine into removing the prosecutor. This was the official and bipartisan policy of the U.S. because they viewed him as corrupt. But if you look at the reporting of Matt Taibbi, he actually goes on to say there were real reasons to believe that this guy was investigating Burisma. Let me slow down. I'm not going to rehash the whole Ukrainegate conspiracy or whatever you want to call it. I'll just say I think Matt Taibbi is right. In his article from October 24th, 2020, Matt Taibbi says, with the Hunter Biden expose, suppression is a bigger scandal than the actual story. Unprecedented efforts to squelch information about a New York Post story may prove to be more dangerous corruption than whatever Hunter Biden did with a crooked Ukrainian energy company. In the story, Matt Taibbi points out there really was an investigation into this guy, but that Rudy Giuliani and that many Trump supporters were taking a maximalist approach. I think Matt Taibbi is correct. I think what was happening with Joe Biden and his son was incidental to the bigger picture. Let me show you another Wikipedia entry. The Russia-Ukraine gas disputes. They mention that, actually, let me read a very important line. Let me just read the opening paragraph. The Russia-Ukraine gas disputes refer to a number of disputes between Ukrainian oil and gas company Naftogaz Ukraini and Russian gas supplier Gazprom over natural gas supplies, prices, and debts. These disputes have grown beyond simple business disputes into transnational political issues, involving political leaders from several countries that threaten natural gas supplies in numerous European countries dependent on natural gas imports from Russian suppliers, which are transported through Ukraine. Russia provides approximately a quarter of the natural gas consumed in the EU. Approximately 80% of those exports travel through pipelines across Ukrainian soil prior to arriving in the EU. What's important to understand is that a large portion of the gas going to Europe comes through Ukraine. What is this? Around 20% of all the gas they receive. So it's referred to by many as a gas monopoly, or at least the Gazprom monopoly in Ukraine, because they have 80% of the gas that's going. It's complicated. I'll put it that way. 80% of 25%. Suffice to say, there are ongoing active disputes as recently as 2005, and it's resulted in large-scale conflict. There's another pipeline. Another conflict called the Qatar-Turkey pipeline. Long story short, Qatar wanted to run a natural gas pipeline through Syria and Turkey into Europe to offset the power that Gazprom had in Europe. I am oversimplifying everything. I'm probably only scratching the surface, but bear with me. This brings us to a much larger story. Well, it was reported, I believe in 2012 by The Guardian, that the U.S. wanted Bashar al-Assad out of power in Syria because he told the U.S. and its allies and our allies that in no way would he allow a natural gas pipeline through Syria into Europe because it would hurt Syria's ally, Russia. This meant, to a great degree, the West was beholden to Russia because of their control on natural gas into Europe. NATO and United States interests needed political influence and power in Ukraine to break apart the power Gazprom had, which meant new gas companies, new pipelines, anything they could do. Which brings me back to the Biden-Ukraine conspiracy theory. I love how they call it a conspiracy theory. I don't think that Joe Biden intervened in Ukraine because he was trying to help his son. I think Hunter Biden was placed on the board of Burisma Holdings because Western forces, the United States, wanted influence in Ukrainian energy politics and the energy sector because we are dealing with conflict with Russia. So people who were working with the political class in the United States were granted these positions and were effectively working for the government in a private capacity. When it turned out that there were investigations into Burisma, Joe Biden intervened not to protect his son and not because the prosecutor was corrupt, but because it wasn't corruption from the U.S. perspective. This is my opinion, by the way. I don't know if there's any true. I'm just saying what I think, scratching the surface, and I could be wrong. I think the U.S. was like, look, we're a foreign country meddling in the energy affairs of Ukraine because we need access to energy. So Joe Biden, the EU, And the International Monetary Fund intervened, saying the prosecutor was corrupt. What it really sounds like to me is the prosecutor was beholden to the Ukrainian people and not Western interests. At the time, Ukraine was being courted by Russia and by NATO. I believe, not NATO, I'm sorry, they're a NATO ally, not a NATO member, but I believe, it might be NATO. They do also, many of them in Ukraine want to be members of the EU because that would do wonders for their economy. Long story short, let's back up a little bit. It's complicated. I'm only scratching the surface. I'm probably getting a bunch of details mixed up and confused because I am by no means an expert on this. But you can see where these things start to, these are puzzle pieces that I have not yet put together for the bigger picture, but there's something here. We're now seeing an escalation. Russia amassing troops. There was some withdrawal from Russia. But that brings me to the new administration and them going after Rudy Giuliani. When Donald Trump was coming into power after he won the election in 2016, we heard, I believe the story is that Michael Flynn said to Sally Yates, he doesn't view Russia as the biggest threat. China is the biggest threat. The previous administration and many working the intelligence sector probably got worried because they had been desperately trying to gain power in terms of natural gas into Europe. Here's what I think happened. I don't think there's this is tough. I do think the political class in this country does view China as a threat, but I think their concern was for our allies in Europe. Donald Trump was a nationalist. He was less concerned about the European Union and more concerned about the American workers. There are especially people in the Democratic Party deferential to China, don't get me wrong. But what the European Union wants to do, one of the ideas behind the European Union is to form a massive power structure that can compete with the rise of China. That means the U.S. and European interests need to get energy into Europe. When Donald Trump started saying, no, we're going to focus on America and we're more concerned with China, many in the intelligence sector and the political class said, stop, what are you doing? We're not going there yet. Freaked out and are now going after those who sought to destabilize their attempts at gaining leverage in Europe. I don't know for sure. I am not heavily researched. Well, I'll put it this way. I've done a lot of research. I've been on the ground. I have friends from Ukraine. I've done some investigating, but I'm probably just getting a ton wrong. And I'll tell you this. The things I'm bringing up right now, I'm sure there's some like CIA or FBI guy like watching my show laughing like, wow, you're like 5% of the way there, but you are so wrong, Tim. That's probably the case. Absolutely. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about what's going on with this stuff other than what's been presented in mainstream news, what other journalists have put out, what my sources in Ukraine have told me. And I think Trump was flubbing up the political establishment's plans for how to deal with Ukraine and Russia. That's what they wanted. Trump was probably told, here's what you got to do. And he said, nah, I don't want to do that. I don't care. Let Russia do their thing. Russia may not be the biggest threat, but I think the U.S. was trying to gain power because they do view China as a threat in the long run. But I do also believe that U.S. interests are hoping to placate China and sort of meld through trade lines, economics, our economies. Thus, there won't be a war. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have access to previous information. I couldn't tell you deep down what's really going on, but I can tell you, according to a Russian minister, U.S.-Russia ties are worse than during the Cold War. From ABC News. Moscow, Russia's top diplomat, said Wednesday that relations with the United States are now even worse than during the Cold War times because of a lack of mutual respect. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow stands ready to normalize ties with Washington, but that the U.S. should stop posturing like a sovereign while rallying its allies against Russia and China. Lavrov said if the U.S. shuns a mutually respectful dialogue on the basis of balance of interests, we would live in conditions of a Cold War or worse. During the Cold War, the tensions were flying high, and risky crisis situations often emerged. But there was also a mutual respect, Lavrov said. It seems to me there is a deficit of it now. The story is from today. Now, it may be that what we're really seeing is the establishment political class and the intelligence agencies completely disagreed with Donald Trump on how to deal with global threats and global politics. Donald Trump, of course, wanted the Abraham Accords. I think ultimately that was bad for U.S. special interests in the political class. Why? The conflict in the Middle East gives the U.S. pretext for sending military to this region and maintaining military bases. So long as Israel is under threat, the U.S. can say, but we have to have soldiers in Syria. But we have to have soldiers in Afghanistan. Donald Trump was like, nah, the American people don't want our soldiers there. And that's true. So the question is it long-term thinking, short-term thinking, who's right, who's wrong? Honestly, I have no idea. I don't think the U.S. has justified its presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think they must. I do. I also understand the difficulty in not revealing confidential information to the American people that could jeopardize our interests and our way of life, and also freedom. I know it seems cliche. George W. Bush, they hate us for our freedoms. I mean, kind of. It's overly simplistic. But my concern is, in 100 years, will this planet be more classically liberal or more authoritarian? I don't know. I think we're heading towards hardcore authoritarianism. I don't know what the outcome will be from U.S. interests or from Donald Trump's interests or nationalist interests. I do know that what the EU has been doing is failing. Marine Le Pen is now gaining in the polls and people think she's likely to win the presidency in the next election. That may be the case. The plans of the establishment political class and the intelligence agencies failed. And it's clear that if they didn't want Donald Trump to win, they did a really bad job of stopping him and the ideas coming from people who support him. In which case, their plans don't work. So I don't know what to tell you. I can tell you, I don't want to see a future dominated by Chinese authoritarianism, or I should say the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarianism. The people of China are fantastic people. It's the Communist Party. It's the political ideology that scares me. And we are seeing a hard escalation, that war may be afoot. Notice that the Russian minister said Russia and China. That's right. From Newsweek, Ukraine President Zelensky is ready for war with Russia, vows to stand to the last man. Ukraine would not stand a chance against Russia at all. Russia may not be the massive superpower it was in the Cold War, but they are still a massively powerful nation with nuclear weapons, and they'll crush Ukraine. They'll do it through subversion, politics, and hot war. And what can Ukraine do to stop it? Probably not a whole lot. But the U.S. could come to the aid of Ukraine, and thus we see a proxy war, which could potentially lead to full-out war between the U.S. and Russia. Now, I think Russia doesn't stand a chance, for the most part, against the U.S. I do think no one will win in a war. It'll just be death and destruction. But when it comes to a clash of political power, I think the U.S. would absolutely crush Russia because of our, expansive power, but not without great cost. Which brings us to the great global Mexican standoff. It's not just Russia, mind you, but the U.S. may feel that it is more powerful than Russia and China individually, but together, probably not. If the U.S. makes a move against Russia and the U.S. is damaged because of it, China then moves in. That's a Mexican standoff. If you're not familiar, it's when three people are standing, each pointing a gun at each other. Nobody wants to pull the trigger because the first person to fire now has their occupied, essentially. As soon as you pull the trigger, the other person can shoot you and you can't do anything about it. So nobody wants to make the first move. If China makes a move against Russia, China will be weakened. The U.S. can move in. If Russia makes a move against either of us, then either of us can move in. That's how it works. So what happens? Slow roll, a slow escalation, and probably an attack on our cultural institutions. You can't just declare hot war, but you can subvert. So it's probably true that Russia does want to subvert the U.S. and interfere in elections. I think that's absolutely true. I just think not particularly effective. Now, China, on the other hand, much more effective. I think the reason we saw the narrative against Russia so much was because the establishment political class from before Trump was desperately trying to stop Russia and gain control of Ukraine. But Russia moved into Crimea, took it, and then in the U.S., Donald Trump won the presidency, and that was that. That was that. I don't know what the best course of action would have been. I don't think, for the most part, there's a bunch of mustache-twirling villains. I think it's competing interests. But I will tell you this. Joe Biden backs the racist and psychotic ideology of critical theory and wokeism. And if we have that as our core ideology, then we do not deserve to have our ideas persist. What should persist is the core American ideals of the founding fathers and classical liberalism, which led to one of the freest countries on the planet in the history of the planet. But right now, the establishment is woke. And that means they believe in fascistic ideologies. And I'll be damned if I'm going to sit back and watch an authoritarian ideology take over. That means they will not have my support no matter what their plan is, so long as Joe Biden supports this psychotic ideology, which is destroying this country. So I can't tell you who the good guys and the bad guys are. I can tell you there's certainly special interests, competing interests. I can tell you it is insanely complicated. And everything I've told you may have just been a mishmash mumbled up of ideas that I don't understand, because I'm far from the smartest person on this issue. So do your research. Follow people like Matt Taibbi who know better than I. But I will tell you something. It is horrifying what they're doing with Rudy Giuliani. Now, I can tell you, look, if someone breaks the law, then they must be prosecuted. And if that's the case, so be it. If Rudy Giuliani was doing something nefarious, good. I don't care. It's not an excuse to simply say he represented the president to let him get away with crimes. But I don't know. In the end, it's all politics. It is all politics. And whether or not Rudy Giuliani did or didn't do anything bad, they're going after the previous administration, the previous president's lawyer. That's freaky stuff. And if we escalate beyond this point, it just seems like more and more. It's a Jenga tower, right? The blocks are being pulled out from the base. It's only a matter of time before the whole thing comes crumbling down. That worries me, because I don't want to live in a country ruled by the Chinese Communist Party or by autocrats like Vladimir Putin. But I don't want to live in a country of a bunch of woke lunatics who are also autocratic, ridiculous cultists. It's not just one faction. It's a hodgepodge mishmash of chaos. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimcastIRL. Check it out. We'll see you all then, and thanks for hanging out.